how the super empath quietly gets everything they need from avoidance. The super empath does not chase, argue, or force emotional availability, yet somehow they still end up getting what they need from even the most distant avoidant personalities. This is not luck, and it is not manipulation in the traditional sense, but a quiet psychological intelligence that understands emotional distance better than most people ever will. While others panic when an avoidant withdraws, the super empath reads that silence like information rather than rejection. And that single shift changes everything in the dynamic. They understand that avoidants are not always running away from people, but often running away from emotional pressure, expectations, and loss of control. So instead of increasing pressure, the super empath reduces it, creating a space where the avoidant feels strangely safe without ever being trapped or demanded from. And in that space, something subtle begins to happen. Because avoidants start to reappear, not due to obligation, but due to curiosity and emotional relief. The super empath never begs for attention, but they also never disappear in bitterness, and this balanced presence becomes psychologically magnetic to someone who fears intensity. What makes this dynamic even more powerful is that the super empath does not attach their self-worth to immediate responses, which removes the emotional leverage avoidants usually depend on. Without pressure or emotional chasing, the avoidant no longer has power through withdrawal, because withdrawal is no longer being met with desperation or collapse. Instead, it is met with calm consistency, and that consistency slowly begins to rewire how the avoidant perceives emotional connection itself. The super empath understands that avoidants often return when their nervous system feels regulated, not when their ego is being chased or confronted. So they become a kind of emotional anchor, steady enough to be trusted, but distant enough to never feel suffocating or invasive. And this is where the quiet power shift begins, because the avoidant starts to associate the super empath with peace rather than pressure or conflict. Over time, the avoidant begins to reach out in small ways, not because they have fully changed, but because they feel less threatened in the connection. The super empath does not rush these moments or overinterpret them, which keeps the emotional environment stable instead of chaotic. This stability is exactly what the avoidant struggles to maintain internally, so they unconsciously start relying on the super empath to experience it externally. But the super empath is never dependent on this reliance, which means they are never trapped in the push and pull cycle that drains most relationships with avoidance. Instead, they observe patterns quietly and respond only when engagement is genuine, not when it is driven by fear of loss or temporary loneliness. This creates a psychological paradox for the avoidant, because the more they withdraw, the less control they actually feel over the emotional connection. And the more they return, the more they realize they are not being punished, judged, or emotionally cornered, which lowers their defenses over time. The super empath uses emotional restraint as a form of strength, not detachment, and this distinction is what makes their approach so effective. They still care deeply, but they do not express that care in a way that sacrifices their dignity or emotional stability. Because of this, avoidants begin to respect the connection rather than fear it, and respect is often the first real bridge toward emotional intimacy for them. The super empath also knows when to step back without making it a dramatic exit, which prevents emotional chaos from taking over the relationship dynamic. This controlled distance teaches the avoidant that connection is not something that disappears under pressure, but something that remains steady even with space. And when space no longer equals abandonment in the avoidant's mind, their entire pattern of avoidance begins to soften naturally. The super empath does not force emotional breakthroughs, but they create the conditions where breakthroughs become possible without resistance. This is why they often seem like they are getting everything they need without demanding anything, because they are working with emotional reality instead of against it. They are not trying to fix the avoidant, but they are also not willing to lose themselves in the process of understanding them. And that balance is what makes the dynamic sustainable, because neither person is completely losing control or identity in the interaction. What most people miss is that avoidants do not respond to intensity, They respond to safety that does not demand surrender of independence. The super empath quietly provides that rare combination of emotional presence without emotional pressure, which makes connection feel possible instead of threatening. Over time, the avoidant begins to test the bond more often, not through words, but through small returns, short messages, and inconsistent but meaningful contact. The super empath does not chase these moments, but they also do not reject them out of pride. Instead, they evaluate consistency over time. This patient observation creates a sense of emotional grounding, where the avoidant slowly learns that connection does not have to feel like loss of control. And when that belief shifts, the entire relationship structure starts to reorganize itself without force or confrontation. The super empath also knows that true emotional influence is not about control, but about becoming the safest option without competing for attention. This is why they often appear calm even in emotionally confusing situations, because their focus is long-term emotional clarity rather than short-term validation. In the end, the super empath quietly gets what they need, not by overpowering the avoidant, but by becoming emotionally unshakable in a world built on avoidance and fear. And ironically, the less they try to force connection, the more naturally the connection begins to form around them in a stable and sustainable way.